us in and we'll get into it.
Cool.
All right, we got my main man, Lucas Ray. Lucas is someone that I have been really interested to talk to, specifically on this topic. And I'm really happy he's making time. He just had a baby, so I feel really, really special. Lou, how you doing, man?
I'm doing good, Miles. Glad to be here, man. I've been loving listening to your podcast. I think it's a great thing to talk about. And so I find it really interesting to tune in and hear what people have to say about their religion.
Yeah, man, it's been fun. So why don't you start us off, as I always have, with how do we know each other, and just tell me a little bit about yourself.
Man, I think our friendship is based on like competition. If I remember right, we'd play softball together, we played football together, like against each other, basketball. I think we had some common friends, and we just in college we'd hang out. We played sports. We're about this. We were. I think you've gotten a little bit bigger than me, like muscle wise. We were about the same size, so we'd always kind of match up against each other in basketball. We were about the
Yeah.
same skill level. I think we both are very competitive, and so it was kind of a good matchup. We both probably thought we were a little better than we really were, so that kind of also fit. So I don't know. I think we both have a passion for sports, and also we're both Cubs fans and Bulls fans and Bears fans. So you got all that common ground. And then,
It's like a typical dude relationship where it's like everything's based on like sports and trying to beat the shit out of each other on whatever playing surface we're at.
yep, that about sums it up, I'd say.
I remember those basketball days because we were in a church league, um, and we always matched up with each other. And I just remember just hacking the hell out of you because I'm not a basketball player, but like
Me neither, man.
I'm not letting Lou score. I know that much.
Yeah, yep, that's about how it was. It's like I'm not gonna let. I can't score. But I can't let Miles score.
Right, exactly. Which didn't happen that much. So I'll say that much. Yeah. So we had some mutual friends, and unfortunately, just life and growing up, I think just kind of got between us a little bit. And I went to Chicago and then Seattle, and you're around our hometown area. So again, I'm just super pumped to have this conversation. All right, so let's start where I always have on this. Talk to me about your faith, spirituality, religion right now at age, I don't know, how old are you? 35, 34?
35. Man, I'm old. 35. Well, my faith. I think faith is a good way to describe it. Um, I have placed my faith completely in Jesus Christ, I would say. And and the way I look at it is, I've thought a lot and given pretty good amount of time to thinking about the religions that are out there, some of the philosophies that are out there. I think it's important to consider and come to a conclusion for yourself on what you believe. And that's why I think faith is such a good word. I would say for me, what's helped shape this journey of my spirituality and my faith in big part has been just frankly reading the Bible. And the more I've read through the Bible and the more I've encountered the person of Jesus in the Bible, I'd say the more that I've felt like that this is the truth. This is what I believe. I get behind the idea that people are made in the image of God, that we have inherent value, um, no matter your race, creed, religion. People are special. There's something special about us, and the Bible does a good job of explaining that for me. And then at the same time, people have this value. They're made in the image of God, but I think we're all fallen. I think if we're honest, none of us are really up to the standard that we should be. Um, if I'm completely honest, I'm just not that good. Like, I'm a prideful person. I'm a selfish person. As I've gotten older, I've noticed it more and more. Just all the flaws I have. It's funny having I have a 2.5-year-old Lily, my daughter, and it's funny having a 2.5-year-old because they haven't lived life long enough to understand how ridiculous it looks to just like wear your emotion on your sleeve. Yesterday we went to Lily's cousin's birthday party, and he turned 2 and Lily's 2.5. And Lily the whole time was asking about if she could open his presents and have his cake. And it was just like totally focused on herself. And I thought, I'm not that different from her. It's just that I know that I can't verbalize those thoughts. And so, anyway, my point is that I think the Bible does a good job of explaining the human condition, which I think is we're special, we're created in the image of God, but yet we're sinful and we're fallen. And then the Bible does a really good job of explaining a solution to that problem. And I think that the solution the Bible offers is unique. And it's unique in the sense that it's not so much about what you do to earn God's favor or what you do to, you know, win your way to heaven. It's more about what God has done for you. So Jesus Christ, the idea of Jesus Christ is that, here is God who he looked down on mankind and he had compassion on us. He had love for us. He saw that we were fallen and he said, I'm going to make a way. I'm going to make a way for them to be right. I'm going to give them hope. And really the only solution to their problem is sacrifice. So I really believe that, our fallen nature in comparison to a holy God, we're just not on a level playing field with him. Like if God is really this being that is perfect and just and right and holy, and we really are these creatures that are unholy and that are sinful, we really can't be in God's presence. And since God is just, he can't just look at what we've done and turn a blind eye to that. He has to deal with it in order to maintain his justice. And so, you know, um, what Jesus what Jesus did and what he represents and who he is the idea that God himself stepped down into creation. It's like the idea of, you know, um, the author of life stepping into the book. And so God stepped into creation as a person in the form of Jesus Christ, and he did what nobody could do, and that is he lived just a completely perfect life. And he taught us how to love, how to live. He showed compassion. He showed compassion to the people who were, you know, the people that were looked down on, that other people looked at and thought, well, this person is no good. Those are the type of people that Jesus befriended. And then Jesus ultimately suffered and died. I believe fully that he suffered and died for each and every one of us. And so the idea is Jesus Christ was a sacrifice on our behalf. So what we failed to do, he fulfilled. And if we want to have acceptance with God, if we want to have a full life, if we want to have hope for an eternity with him, which I do believe is an option, I think the only way to that is through putting your faith in the work of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice for you. So in a nutshell, I mean, there's a lot more to it, but in a nutshell, just very basically, it's I believe that Jesus died for my sins and he loves me. And that faith is what saves me. It's not me fixing the wrongs that I've done or me, going to church so often or me doing this good thing or that good thing. It's completely based on the work of Jesus and my faith in that work.
Got it. Yeah, that doesn't sound like you've thought about this at all, Lou. Um, no, no, that's
I have given it, I think it's an important question. I think I don't like it when people just kind of follow along with the culture or with their family and they don't give it thought. I think it's an important question and it's one that's worth a lot of thought.
no, I definitely agree. So you gave me a lot there. I want to start maybe at this first thing that you said, and I want to kind of back up and figure out like how we got to where Lou is today.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that your faith is completely in Jesus Christ. Like that's where you have centered yourself. You didn't mention Christianity. You didn't mention any denominations within Christianity. What are your thoughts on just like those different outlets and just the different
Yeah.
factions? You've kind of simplified it. It looks like in your mind to that one thing, which I think is cool. But
Yeah.
how and why?
That's a really good question. I think the reason I do that, I think it's intentional. It's because people are flawed, and I think that denominations oftentimes are flawed, and we want to push a grid onto like a denomination or a religion, but I think it really boils down to the work of Jesus Christ. And I think I would I would find common ground with a lot of different denominations within Christianity, to in the degree to which they they place their trust in the work of Jesus Christ, and the degree to which they hold the Bible as holy and true. Um, I think that you try to find common ground with people, and you don't look. I'm not looking to find disagreement between me and another human or another person who's trying to be religious or another Christian. Um, so I think at the very simplest and basic form, it's I believe the Bible's holy. I believe that if you put your faith in Jesus, you're saved, and you have salvation and you have life. So there's a lot of denominations where I would not agree with everything they do. And I've given a lot of thought to the Bible as I've read through it, and I form my own opinions on how you ought to live out your faith. But so there might be denominations where I'm like, I disagree with how they do this and that, but I get behind the fact that they love Jesus, and I can find common ground there. Whereas there might be other people who would call themselves Christians, and or denominations that would come off as if they were Christians, but they don't really believe that Jesus is what saves them. It's really, for a lot of denominations, it's really about the works that the people are doing within the congregation, or it's really a cultural thing to say that you're a Christian. And so for me, I think, let's boil it down to one simple thing, and that's Jesus. And so, if you're picturing like a target, like if you're an archer, and like the middle of that target is your faith in Jesus Christ and his work on the cross. Like if you've got that piece right, I don't care if there's a bunch of stuff around that that's a little bit off. I mean, I care, but it's not as big a deal. I think we have common ground. Whereas, if you're calling yourself a Christian, or and you don't, or whatever, but you don't believe in Jesus and his work, it's like, well, really, we don't believe the same thing. Or if you don't really believe that the Bible is true and authoritative, we probably don't believe the same thing. Um, so yeah, that's why I'm careful not to. I don't want to be associated with. Honestly, I don't want to be associated with a denomination in particular. And if you think about it, my brain's kind of trailing here. I'm sorry, but
This is
this
great.
kind of popped into my mind. Like, I'm a Cubs fan and you're a Cubs fan, and you wouldn't you wouldn't associate with every other Cubs fan. Like I remember that I've been to there was a Cubs game. Actually, I might have been there with you. Do you remember the Cubs game? Were you there when there was like, I think it was opening day, and maybe we were playing the Brewers, and there were some Cubs fans who were just getting like drunk and belligerent, and they were just being jerks to the Brewers fans. And it's like, man, like I don't want to be associated with that. I don't want to be a jerk. And those Brewers fans who are there, they probably, like it or not, the rest of their lives they're going to look at Cubs fans and think that they're all jerks. Maybe not, but they might have that thought in the back of their mind. So anyway, that's kind of a tangent, but I think it's
Well,
easy
most of them are jerks, Lou. So to
that
be fair to the Brewers fan,
I mean, I didn't want to say it, Miles, but you were the jerk. No, I'm just. But it's easy to just like group people and label people, and so one bad experience can turn you off to religion or Christianity, and it's not. I don't think that's necessarily fair. Basically,
sure, that makes sense. So for you, like, what is being a person of faith following Jesus? How what does that look like? Is it do you have a church? Do you go to church? Is it mostly at home?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, we go to a church. We go to a church here in town. I I think that Jesus's commands were pretty like he kind of boiled it all down to somebody came to Jesus in the Gospels and said, what is it that we must do, and what are the most important commands? And he said, you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and you love your neighbor as yourself. So as far as living out Christianity, if you want a really concise answer, that's what I try to emulate is I try to love the Lord, appreciate and be thankful for the things that I have. I recognize that I live in a culture and a time where I have a lot of benefits, and I like to attribute those to the Lord, and so I try to be thankful, I try to love him, and then try to love other people. Even people that might annoy me, I try to love. But we go to church. We go to church. I eat up the Bible. I love reading. I don't read for long periods of time, but it's a habit, like a habit almost like working out, where every day I read a little bit, and I try to really mull over what I read and think about what I read. I spend a little time every day praying, talking to Jesus. If I have things I'm worried about before the day starts, kind of I start my morning off in prayer. And yeah, I mean, I guess as far as living out your religion, it's loving the Lord, loving other people. I enjoy spending time reading the Word, praying, go to church on Sundays. We've got a small group, which is just basically like every other week, a few of us friends get together and we pray for each other. We read the Bible. We talk about what we think it means, and then we also do stuff like barbecue and hang out together, and it's just kind of fun. So kind of a hangout, basically.
Sure. Yeah. More fellowship.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so let's. I want to talk about the Bible with you, but let's back it up here. So, Tiny Lou, when you were growing up, um, you, if memory serves, your dad was a minister or a pastor. Is that right?
No, he's
Oh, okay. We'll edit that out.
no, no, it's okay. He's just a dude. I don't know, but he is a Christian guy. My mom
Sure.
and my dad are both they would call themselves Christians, and they were we grew up going to church. They would take us to church. Um, they were really good about teaching us. Here's what the Bible has to say. Here's what we believe. But they were clear, like tried to make it clear that we got to as kids and as we grow into adults think about what we believe and something make that decision of faith on our own. It's not something that you can just kind of culturally fall into. Um, and that's
So your parents encouraged thought. Then it sounds like, even if it, what if that would led you outside of Christianity? Like, do you think they would have been comfortable with that? Would they encourage that, or was it more just to figure out like, hey, figure out what your faith is within the context of how we were raised?
That's a good question. I think since it's so faith based, like the idea of putting your faith in Jesus and finding salvation in that, I think that they really encouraged giving it thought and figuring out what you believed. And I think they were really good about kind of explaining that, you know, you're going to have some sort of belief system, whether you acknowledge that or not, or whether you call it that or not. You really you look at the world a certain way and you believe a certain way, and it's important to question what you're thinking and why. And so they did a good job of that, and also just my father and mother really believed that the Bible was true, that it was a book inspired by God, and I could tell that by the way that they approached it and thought about it and talked about it, and that was probably kind of a contagious thing.
Yeah, for sure. So you have parents that are kind of encouraging this free thought. When did that actually start to take root for you?
Oh man, I can really vividly remember going to church with them as a kid, one Sunday in particular, and walking out of the church service and thinking to myself,
Do you remember how old you were?
oh man, I don't know. It was like grade school. I was young, but I remember having this thought that like I just was in church singing these songs and being part of this thing that I have not bought into. Like that I don't really know if this is true, and I just remember thinking about that, like, huh, like I haven't bought into this. This is something my parents do that they're bought into, and like the other people in the church looks like they've bought into this. I haven't yet. So yeah, I remember that pretty clearly as a kid, having that thought.
What was that scary for you?
No, I think it was it was a good thought in the sense that, hey, I'm an individual, I'm a person who needs to come to a conclusion on what I believe. And I think it actually helped me to say, I'm independent here. I need to think about whether this is something I want to do going forward, whether this is something I embrace. I know my parents do, and that's fine, but is this something I believe?
So what then happens? Like, are you talking with people in the congregation? Are you researching on your own? What does that experience look like?
Well, as a kid, you're not really as a little kid, I don't think I put a ton of thought into it, but I do remember having this thought and being able to understand this idea that, you know, I don't think I am good. I do think that there is a God, and I do think he's just, and getting behind the idea of believing in Jesus and putting my faith in him. I do remember I would call it a conversion experience for sure. Waking up one morning and just having that thought of, I need to really seriously consider what I've been listening to in church. Is Jesus real? I need to make up my mind about that. And I think though so I think that was probably the start of where I would say that I really, as I thought about it, thought it made sense and began to trust Jesus as a kid. And that thought wasn't fully developed. I didn't fully understand um, religion like I do now, or Christianity like I do now. But that was kind of the seed, and then as I got older, there was just more. You know, I can remember a couple people in particular when I must have been like, I think I was 13 or 14. I remember listening to a pastor, and he threw out this challenge saying, I challenge you to read the Bible every day for a year. And I hate challenges, but I remember thinking, you know what? I don't want this faith of mine to just be something that's like a secondhand thing that I just go along with what people in my church do. I want to really read it for myself and understand it. And so as a 13 or 14-year-old, I made that commitment, and I read the Bible every day for a year. And I thought it was an eye-opening experience for me, kind of like a coming of age for me, where all of a sudden I'm able to look at the Bible and make decisions on what I think it's saying and how that applies to my life. And there were things that as I read, I noticed that like my church at the time wasn't really practicing, and I just thought that, I don't know, I thought it was really wonderful to be able to go directly to the source in my mind. Like, here I am going to the Bible and learning what God has to say from him. It's not necessarily coming through a lens of, a context of a cultural church in Iowa where I lived, like a traditional, it was a Baptist church at that time that we went to. It's not coming through that context. It's just, this is the unfiltered word of God that I'm reading. And so I really fell in love with doing that, with reading the Bible for myself and kind of forming my own thoughts about what it had to say. And then there was this awesome, like this guy, there was this guy, his name was Charles Alber, and our pastor at the time when I was in high school, he was a chaplain, and he got called up into active duty. And so when he got called up into active duty, this old retired pastor came in, and he preached for like, I don't know if it was a year or a year and a half, but the guy just, he'd get up there and he'd open the Bible and he preached it like it was real, almost like no one I've ever heard before. And I remember, being a kid and sitting there and thinking, as I was listening to him, like, this is incredible what he's saying. Like, this is true. Like, this is true that Jesus came and died for me, that there's a heaven. And it's hard to even explain. I will say that, as a high schooler, you don't want to, as a high school boy, I should say, you don't want to at all show any kind of weakness, but I would just sit there and like it was so moving that I would be like trying to hold back tears as I listened to the guy preach. It was just there's no way else to explain it other than it was a very supernatural experience and something that's kind of stuck with me throughout my life. I mean, those were really formative years for me. Is to actually, learn from a guy who took the Bible so seriously.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I feel like that's not a unique experience for people of faith where they have those moments that really stick out and were the crux of like the beginning, one way or the other, whichever way you
Yeah,
decide you're going to go. You mentioned the term secondhand faith, which I really liked because I think that kind of encapsulates like what you're trying to get at, which is like what do I, Lou, actually believe versus just absorbing what other people are telling me. I really, really, really like that term. Um, the other thing that you mentioned just now was I think you mentioned that I don't think that I'm good. And
yeah.
so what happens after that and kind of going through, your faith, why how do you know that you're not good? What signals that for you? Is it something that, is a theme in the Bible that is important, or is it something that was inherent, that was taught to you?
I think yes to that question. I think that you know that sense of guilt you have when you do something
No,
that
I don't know what you're talking about.
right. I mean, it's such a universal thing that you can joke about it, right?
Sure.
You do something and you're like you feel guilty about it. And I think that sense that permeates all cultures at all times. And I think that there are psychopaths out there who have been able to really suppress that. And there are people who, if you tell yourself a lie long enough, you believe it. So if you convince yourself that you're not so bad and you tell yourself that over and over again, eventually you start to believe that you're perfect. And all of a sudden you got Aaron Rodgers type mentality on your hands and you're some quarterback who thinks he's the best thing in the world and he's really not. I
Yeah.
digress. I digress.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
He's no Justin Fields, I guess. Oh man,
That's right.
we're
He
just we're
can be.
yeah, we're just going down a
I know
road
you
here.
can edit all that. That was that was not. But my idea, the idea is like I think that we have those feelings of guilt. Whether you're a religious person or not, you do something and you feel guilty. I remember as a kid, I stole a ball from the ball pit at McDonald's and felt so guilty about it. It's
By the
like,
way, I know this story. I remember you telling us this story. I vividly remember you telling us this story. This is so funny to me.
oh my goodness, it's just like I don't know, and so I think well, a couple of things. The Bible would teach you that, and I believe this is true, that those kind of feelings of right or wrong are an indication that there is a just God and that you are aware of a standard that He has put in place. So, you know, first and foremost, I'd say just you're conscious as a person, having that's an indication that there's somebody that you feel that you are accountable to. And then as you start to read through the Bible, it really expands on that idea a lot. It talks about the sinfulness of, our human natures, how we're by nature, we're prideful. We put ourselves first. And that's not to say that everything we do is prideful and we're always putting ourselves first, but we have a sinful nature. And it's kind of this internal struggle because the Bible also teaches that we're made in the image of God and we have the capacity to do incredible good and we have the ability to reason and think that's makes us different from all other creatures. So I think it was a combination of just, my own conscience at times would bug me. And then also, reading through the Bible and understanding where that comes from and the root of that.
Got it. Sorry, I'm just trying to phrase my next question here.
You're fine.
Um, okay, so high school, we have that big moment with that preacher that was filling in, kind of a very introspective, emotional moment for you. What happens after that? You started to dig into it a little bit more. Like, talk to me about like the college years and times before you had a family.
Yeah, I mean, I just started to read the Bible on my own more and understand the power that it had. There's just something life giving about reading it, and I enjoyed it. I've always really enjoyed the friendships I've had within church. I've been fortunate to have some really good friends who also believe what I believe, and that helps kind of solidify and strengthen your faith in some ways. And then also just I've seen God provide for me in some pretty incredible ways, and it's just the journey. It's nothing like I don't have a lot of moments where it's like, oh, this amazing miracle happened. But I do I do just sense God's presence, just day in and day out, and I I appreciate what He's done for me, and have had some really good fellowship over the years with other people who share the same faith I have, and yeah, I'd say it's one of those things where you just kind of you know you live your life and you enjoy it. I don't know.
Sure, that makes sense. So, the Bible obviously is a huge part of your life. Reading it daily. One of the things that I've always found fascinating about the Bible is just the history behind it. You have a bunch of different dudes writing at different time periods, and then it all comes together through different translations over thousands of years, and
Yeah,
then we've got this thing today that is pretty universal across different religions, with some things taken out or put in. Knowing that humans created this, we've already talked about how we're flawed from a Christianity perspective. How can we trust the Bible as much as Christians do?
that's a great question. There's always going to be a component of faith with something like trusting the Bible, but I think from what I can tell, and I've done quite a bit of reading on it, I think that we have very reliable translations of the Bible. You're right. The Bible isn't like a book that was just written by one person at one time, but it's really written over hundreds of years. The most recent books of the Bible are a couple thousand years old. So it's an ancient book. It's written in several different languages. You got Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. And but one of the cool things about it is there is this incredible, for me, this is something that's really I think really validates its truthfulness, is that there's these incredible overarching themes in the Bible between the Old Testament and the New Testament, like I said, spanning hundreds of years, where in the Old Testament you have these themes of God is going to send a Messiah to fix what's broken. And then you see that theme fulfilled in the New Testament through Christ. And it's really incredibly coherent. And I think that that's amazing, because if you were to get a bunch of people and you were to have them write about write about a shared experience, even, you could get some inconsistencies, but it seems to me that the Bible is really incredibly consistent, and it's one of the best preserved ancient books that we have. It's really pretty remarkable, if you're religious or not religious, just from a historical perspective, to have a book that's been preserved so well over thousands of years. It's worth it's worth reading or looking into just for that reason alone. It's pretty incredible. The actual manuscripts we have, like ancient manuscripts we have of the Bible, it's incredible. Like, we don't have manuscripts of Shakespeare like we do of the Old Testament, which is thousands of years old. We've got, the Dead Sea Scrolls. You've got these scrolls from Jeremiah and Isaiah. These things are literally thousands of years old, and they're intact. And they find those scrolls, and they compare them to versions that they have today of those Old Testament books, and there's not inconsistencies. So you know that you've had a faithful translation and rendition of the Bible kept over the years. It hasn't really changed as far as we can tell. So I think for those reasons, it's pretty remarkable. And I would say that that even indicates that there's probably a supernatural presence at work to preserve the books of the Bible.
The cynic in me, I think, thinks, couldn't you have that happen anyway? If you have a goal, say you're a church, and at that time, and you're trying to convince others of this faith that you have, wouldn't it be possible to just have those themes be consistent when you're putting together books?
Yes, if you were putting them all together. But if you think about the fact that, you know, you had someone like Moses who was writing the first few books of the Old Testament, and then 2,000 years later or more, you have a guy named Paul, and there's a consistency in their writings and in their stories. And the other incredible thing is like the predictive nature of some of the prophecies in the Bible are just, it's pretty incredible. I mean, you have to, if you're a cynic, you do have to deal with that. There's prophecies in the Old Testament indicating where Jesus would be born, how he would die, and historically, I think there is really good evidence to believe that even apart from the Bible, that Jesus fulfilled those prophecies in the Old Testament, and that's something to explain. I think that's a hard nut to crack as a skeptic. How do you explain the consistency and then also the prophetic nature of some of the Old Testament books?
Um, Sorry, I'd made some notes here.
You're fine.
Okay, so one of the other things you mentioned in the Bible was that God has to deal with our flaws. So he's a perfect being. So
Yeah,
now he's having to deal with humans' flawed nature.
yeah.
Why create us flawed? Or is that even an incorrect question based
No,
on
that's a good, it's a really good question. I think.
okay.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So why create us flawed? I think the Bible tries to unwrap this story at the beginning in Genesis, where
hmm
the picture is you have paradise, and God makes these people, Adam and Eve, and they're created in His image, and they choose to wreck that. Basically, it's like they're given the keys to the car, and they choose to just wreck it. And in Jesus,
It's
or
basically Ferris
well,
Bueller's Day Off in biblical
it is
terms.
just like, oh gosh, you guys, thanks, you really ruined it. So God created, He created people, I think, that have the ability to do incredibly good things, and also the ability to be disobedient, or basically essentially haters of God. Is what ended up happening, is that they elevated themselves, and they doubted who God was, and they refused to give him his due and to trust what he had to say, that it was good. God didn't have to rectify the situation, is the incredible thing. God could have just been like, all right, I set you up perfectly. I didn't create robots here who had to do what I said, but I gave you free will. I gave you the ability to choose right from wrong, and you chose to screw it up. I'm done with you. I think he easily, and I think that would logically have been a good result of what mankind did. Um, but God, for some reason, chose to be very incredibly gracious and loving towards mankind. And yeah, I don't know why he he would be. It's almost unbelievable. I believe it. I do believe it, but it's incredibly gracious, especially if you consider the fact that, you know, even from in that story in Genesis, there's an amazing prophecy of a seed that would be born. And that theme is all throughout the Old Testament. This idea of a seed was like someone, there's a curse on Eve after she eats the apple, and then there's also this prophetic blessing. And the blessing is that you're going to have this seed, this offspring, who's going to crush Satan's head, or the serpent's head, as it's described in Genesis. And that seed, of course, if you trace it through the Old Testament, it gets in the whole Old Testament, kind of narrows it down, and it narrows it down to a specific group of people, the Jews, and it narrows it down to Abraham and his offspring. and then a specific line, which is the Davidic line, King David, and there's prophecies made concerning King David and the coming Messiah, and so that theme of a seed is coherent throughout the Old Testament, and then it's fulfilled in Christ. So when you read the Gospels in the New Testament, you'll notice that a lot of the Gospels start off with this long genealogy because it's really important that they have a connection between Jesus and David, or Jesus and Adam, going all the way back to Genesis to tie the whole picture together. And so I'm kind of rambling, but the point is important. The point is that God made this promise that he would fix the situation that mankind screwed up by himself taking on the suffering and the pain. He would enter in as the Messiah who would die on the cross. And it's an incredible story. Why he would do it, it's kind of baffling if you really consider what the Bible is saying. It's incredible that God would do something like that. I can only really comprehend it. I think when I think about, like, having kids now, when I think about my kids and what I would do to protect them, even if they were disobedient, or even if they were, grew up and they were disrespectful, I would do anything. I would die for my kids. And I think that there's kind of a sense of that with God and us. It's like he just, even though we don't deserve it, he just would die for us. He would love us.
Is there anything in the Bible that makes you uncomfortable?
Huh. It makes me uncomfortable a lot. I mean, to be honest, I'll read through it, and it's uncanny how when you read through the Bible, there's there's conviction of sin, or there's like these eye-opening things you'll read where it just feels to me like it almost understands me better than I understand me. It's almost like it's reading me at times. And I'd say a lot of times it I don't know if it's uncomfortable in a bad way, but it's just like it's a challenge to read through it. I don't think there's anything where it's like, I can't believe that. But I do think there are things where it's like, oh, that is true, and I never would have thought about it that way. Or there are challenges, like here's an example. Like Jesus says, if you want to follow me, you need to take up your cross and follow me. And the idea there is you have a burden to bear, and you're going to bear that burden until you die. Like that's kind of an uncomfortable thing if you think about it. It's like you need to take your life so seriously in some sense that you would even that you would even die for the faith that you have. And in fact, a lot of people have died for their faith. So I think those types of things, they are kind of, if you really think about what Jesus is saying, they make you a little bit uncomfortable. Or I mean, reading Jesus is just great. Like if you read through the Gospels, it's incredibly convicting. And Jesus says things like, I say, you've heard it said that you shouldn't commit adultery, but I say to you, if you looked at a woman with lust in your eyes, you've committed adultery. And you just think about some of those statements. What Jesus is saying is, it's like he is explaining the degree to which you are sinful and fallen, but then at the same time he flips it around, and he provides a remedy for that problem.
And so the remedy then would be believing in God.
Yeah.
Got
Well,
it.
believing specifically in Jesus and his death for you. Um, yeah. For
So
God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that who would ever believe in him would not perish but have everlasting life. It's pretty simple concept, but yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
I don't know if it's that simple for other people to understand. Rather, so I mean, it's rather complex when you think about God. Like people believe in God, like basketball players thank God after a game. We
Yeah.
have God in different parts of our life. Thank God for this, thank God for that. But in Christianity, there's that caveat of Jesus dying on the cross, and that's the beginning of everything. So you can't
Yeah.
have one without the other. That seems like a pretty complex thing to wrap your head around. Like if you're coming into Christianity for the first time in your life and you
Yeah.
get described that, like you might get some funny looks.
Oh man, I think you're right. I think that you're hitting on it exactly, Miles. It's that is that is one of the key differences between what Christians would believe in many other religions. It's a really unique look on life. Definitely. Very unique. A very unique idea.
So, would you say that, like, would it be fair to say that we haven't looked outside to other religions because those other religions don't have Jesus? Is that what brings you back? Is that like the biggest thing for you?
Well, I'd say that, the biggest thing for me it's not one thing. It's a combination of things. You know, it's kind of one of those fuzzy things, like a feeling you have, where, if you were to say, you're married to Jordan, and it's like, why her? And you could list out some reasons why, but there's also going to be this part of it where it's like, I love her. I don't, I can't fully articulate that, but I have this relationship where I love her. And I'd say that
For me,
Christianity's
she was standing there and she said yes, so it all worked out for me.
okay, okay. But yeah, that's funny. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's this part of it where it's like, it's kind of hard to explain. It definitely is just like a love or a relationship. And then there's also part of it where it's like, by nature, I'm a very analytical person and a very skeptical person. I don't sound like that right now, maybe because I'm kind of gushing about something that I really have bought into, but I'm an accountant. I I worked as an auditor for a long time. I don't trust everything at face value. I kind of have to dig into things, and that's just my nature. So, as far as Christianity is concerned, I've put a lot of thought and time into digging into and trying to poke holes in it. And I have found sufficient evidence, I feel, that would indicate to me that the Bible is reliable and this religion's reliable. But it doesn't take away the need for like a faith or a relationship. You'll never, there's always going to be a faith component when it comes to Christianity. You will never have like, okay, here's the list of the facts and here's the list of the evidence, Miles. Now you have all that information, you're good. It just doesn't really work like that.
Yep. Um, I want to get to a couple other different topics, so let's move away from the Bible. Uh, so one of the things that Keenan and I talked about on our first episode was this concept of free will and how it can kind of butt heads with how others might see the world. And in Christianity, the claim is that there is free will, because you have the choice to believe or not. What's your, and please tell me if I'm wrong with that statement, but what's your interpretation of free will and how it relates to Christianity?
I don't know if I fully understand how free will works. I think that's a great question. I'll say that I think that God has given us the ability to make choices for ourselves and free will. At the same time, I definitely think God is sovereign and has the ability to step in and intervene in our lives and in our actions. And those two things I think are kind of paradoxical to play with. And I don't know that I can fully explain how those two things work. I think that, you know, that's a great question. I don't know. I don't know. I think that both are true. I think that God is sovereign and I think that we have free will. And I think that the Bible supports it teaches both of those ideas. It's probably likely, as far as I can tell, that God's probably more sovereign than we realize. And I'm fine with that because I think God's good. But that in and of itself might be kind of a tough pill for some people to swallow.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm always fascinated with free will and religion, just, personally and selfishly. Speaking of other religions, I mean, have you had thoughts about how they interact with Christianity? Have you had thoughts about digging into them and seeing if there's any overlap with what you may believe? Maybe maybe Judaism or Buddhism is like better suited for you as a person, but
Yeah.
how would you know that? But depending on where you live or depending on what you want to know, like what's been your relationship with other religions?
Well, that's a good question. I try to give them thought, and I think it's interesting because you've got Judaism and Christianity are pretty. They have a lot of overlap. We share a lot of the same books, and then even with Islam, there's a lot of overlap. And I think that one of the key differences is this idea of justification by faith. It's like we're putting, as Christians, our faith in the work of Jesus Christ, where I think that kind of differentiates us, and that makes sense to me. I don't think if I had to follow the customs and the laws of Judaism that I would be able to continue to do that. And in fact, I think that the way Judaism is set up and the Old Testament is set up is I think it's if especially if you read the Old Testament historical books, like the narrative books, you see this cycle of the Jewish people failing God over and over again. And I think that that's a pointer towards Christ. And I think that's what the point of the Old Testament is. I don't think the point is we find this system of laws, and if we're obedient to it, we can earn God's favor. I just don't buy that. I don't think that anybody's good enough to earn God's favor. I think
What
God's incredibly gracious, and I guess that's kind of the point. It's like God wants to give you a free gift, and He just holds it out to anybody. Just, I will give you this gift. It's not anything you're doing. I love you. I've done the work. You can trust me.
that's a very beautiful sentiment, by the way. What about so I'm trying to figure out a way to ask this question that isn't just like, do you believe in heaven? It's more of what's more important for you. We've talked about a lot about like putting your faith in Jesus, putting your faith in God, and having that feeling of someone watching over you and that graciousness that you just mentioned. What's more important for you as a Christian today? Is it the now or is it what comes next, which, afterlife, heaven, however you want to phrase it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was just reading last week. There's this parable Jesus gives. He says, "I'm the good shepherd," and he talks about that idea. And he says, "I came to give life and to give it more abundantly." And I was thinking about that phrase, and the idea is, I came to give life. That's the idea of salvation. Like, I came to give life. I came to free you. But then he also and I think that's where a lot of Christians perhaps would stop, is they'd say, I have life. And that's life in a spiritual sense. I believe that when I die, I will go to heaven. And I do personally believe that. And I think that's what Jesus is saying when he says, I come to give life, is you have a hope after you die of an eternity in heaven, like the most perfect place you could be. You're in the presence of God Himself. You're with Jesus. You're in heaven. There's no more sorrow. There's no more pain. It's wonderful. So that's the idea of I give life. But then he says, and I come to give life, and then I come to give it more abundantly. And that idea of an abundant life, I think it has implications for the here and now in the world today. And I think I want to be careful with that, because it's not, some people teach that, like, hey, if you become a Christian, your life's going to be great, it's going to be easy, you're going to make a bunch of money. The idea there is this, like, health and wealth. And I just don't see that anywhere in the Bible. We're following, if you're a Christian, you're following and trying to be a disciple of Jesus who suffered greatly, who wasn't wealthy. So it just doesn't seem that idea, I don't think, is true. But the idea of an abundant life is that, in the midst of hardship and trials, that there is joy. And I don't mean like happiness. I mean, like, there's like this deep-seated joy you can experience even in the midst of hardship. And so it's both. It's You have a more full life, a more joyful life, knowing Jesus, and then you also have this hope of heaven and eternity with Him.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, the afterlife.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'd ever heard that phrase of like the abundance of life and how like what that could mean to still being on earth and being a Christian moving forward. What's your how do people get into heaven in your faith in your world? Is it, do you have to believe, and if you don't, you're not there, or how do you square that?
Oh yeah, I think it's very it's very much a truth claim. Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes through the Father except through me." And that makes sense. I mean, if the whole narrative is true that you can't be good enough and you can't earn it, it makes sense that hey, you either have to put your faith in what Jesus has done. If you're going to try to do it on your own, that's counter to that's counter to what Jesus was all about. It would, if you could achieve it on your own, then why did Jesus have to come and die? So yeah, I think very much so that, and I think, and I will say that I do think in our culture today, people don't want to offend, and so they don't want to say like, well, you know, you're wrong, or I believe this, and we're kind of afraid of that. But it's just interesting to me that like when it comes to religion, which I think is like one of the most important topics that there is, that all of a sudden we don't want to make a truth claim about it. It's like if you ever heard the expression, like there are many pathways to God. Like if you picture God as like a mountain top or something, like you might go up this way, I might go up this way, you might believe this, I might believe that, we're all going to end up in the same place. And that, I feel like that idea is really common today. But like if somebody like came to you, you live in Madison, and say somebody from out of town was driving around and he saw you and he's like, hey man, I'm lost, I need help getting back to the interstate, can you point me in the right direction? If you responded to that dude and you're like, you know, you can go any direction you want and you're going to end up at the interstate, the guy would be like, what do you mean, man? Just help point me in the right direction. And I think so. My point is that, like, I think it's okay to believe in a religion and be like, this is what is true. And I want you to also know this and have this and experience this. I kind of think it's silly if we're just going to be like, yeah, you can do this and I can do this and we can do these different things and they all have the same end. It's like, come on, we can be honest and say that we can agree to disagree. You know what I mean? It's like there can be truth about religion. There's truth about all kinds of other topics. Why couldn't there be truth about religion as well?
That's an interesting thought. I don't know if I've ever thought about it that way. How okay, so it sounds like for you, Jesus is the way. Jesus is the way to heaven. And if you don't believe that Jesus is the way to heaven, then heaven's probably not in your future. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that I wish people were more upfront about that. I mean,
Sure.
I think that there
I
is
mean,
a
it's a
heaven and
scary
that there's
thing,
a
Boo.
hell. Yeah, it
Like,
is. It's
when
serious.
yeah, because if you think about, you mentioned Judaism, Islam, a lot of overlapping teachings. They're beautiful people that might believe in that. There's terrible people that believe in Christianity too.
Yeah.
Terrible people that believe in other religions too. So like, there's all different types of people that believe in different things. How how do you square that as someone that is somebody that believes in humanity?
Yeah.
I'm not phrasing this the way that I want to, but what I'm trying to get at is
Why does one person deserve it more than another, maybe?
maybe that's what I'm the crux of what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah. I mean, I think a simple answer to that is that I don't think any of us deserve it, and that's the idea of
Hmm.
grace. It's I don't deserve it more than you, or I don't deserve it more than anybody else. In fact, I probably deserve it less than a lot of people. And that's the beautiful thing about what Jesus did. It's offered freely to everyone, and you know, there's nobody who deserves it. I guess that's the point. Like nobody is good enough to deserve it, but God is loving enough to offer it to anyone. And and again, like if you if you could earn it, or there was something that you could do to get it, or to think that way, it diminishes who God is and what he had to do for you.
That's an interesting thought. How do you think about what do you well? What's your thought and opinion on how people can fall into a religion based on their location? For example, if you're, a tribe in the Amazon, chances are you've probably never heard about Jesus or Islam or any of that, and you never even have a chance to believe in Jesus. And I'm sure that you've had this question, proposed to you before, but what's your take on that?
I mean, it's a really good question. I think people oftentimes like to paint Christianity as kind of this white American religion. But if you think about it, it's really a religion that's it's originated in the Middle East. It's it's infiltrated North America, Europe. Right now, actually, it's spreading in China at an incredible rate. I ran into a guy. This would have been about a month ago, who's going to NIU. He's going to grad school at NIU, and he's a believer. And we have this kind of instant bond. And I get to talking to him. I find out that in his village in Africa that they have a church and they believe in Jesus. And it's kind of it's really kind of amazing how universal the gospel is and how readily available it is all over the world. And I trust that I trust that God has spread that purposefully. Like the gospel and the word about Jesus, basically when I say gospel, I just mean, the good news about Jesus. It's really incredibly spread. It's incredible where it is and how it's been brought about and brought to all these different countries. So I guess I leave that in God's hands to a degree, to say that He's able to spread it, and He has. And it's pretty amazing too if you think about just historically the level of persecution that there was in Rome right after Jesus had died. And the church has experienced quite a bit of, when I say church, I mean just collectively, like Christianity. It's experienced um, quite a bit of persecution in China right now. There is I don't I think persecution's a fair word. It's definitely not. It's definitely frowned upon, but Christianity is growing there. So there's just this uncanny way over the last couple thousand years that this message has spread throughout the world. So I think that's another indication that that's something of God, because I don't know, a lot of religions are kind of, and I shouldn't say this for certain, but it seems like a lot of religions are kind of based to a specific geographic area, and that's kind of changed recently as our the economy's becoming more global and that kind of thing. But Christianity really has spread and not really necessarily changed the way cultures function, but it's like infiltrated like quite a few different cultures over time. And it's people have tried to stamp it out, and governments have tried to stamp it out, and they just can't seem to kill it. So I think it's almost, you know, a way of validating its truthfulness.
Sure, that makes sense. Um, I think the last question I want to ask you is, so let me preface this by saying there's a scene in South Park from maybe like 10 years ago, and I watched it that one time, and it's been seared into my memory because it was so funny to me, and it kind of started me on this journey of trying to figure out like what it is that I believe. And the scene is that for some reason all the boys are in hell or something like that, and they're talking to the devil, and it's the end of the episode, and they're like, "Well, what was the right answer for religion?" And the devil was like, "Mormonism," and everybody's like, "Oh, of course." So it's a funny joke, but
Yeah.
the reason I preface that by saying that is like, how do you know that you're right? How do you know? And I think I know what you're going to say for the answer, but
Yeah.
how do you know that you're right?
It's faith. I don't think
Yeah, that's what I
I
thought
could
you were going to say.
yeah, I don't think I can explain it any other
Yeah, no,
way.
I get it.
I think it's just, I have faith that it is true.
Is that scary for you? That it all relies on faith, and that other people might have faith in a completely different thing.
No, I don't. No, I don't think so. I think if you really think about it, that every one of us has faith in something. And, whether you've identified it and thought about it and talked about it or not, you do. I mean, you have faith in something. And, um, no, I don't think I honestly, I have a lot of comfort in my faith, to be honest with you. It doesn't, it's a very comforting thing for me.
I think that's beautiful, honestly. I think that, for somebody that is trying to live a spiritual life, I respect you an immense amount because like I can tell your conviction. I've known you for quite a while, and I don't think that's ever wavered. But in that unwavering, you've done research and you've like not read something to then solidify what you believe. You read something to ask yourself questions, and I think that's a really really cool thing, though. And I just
Thanks, Miles.
appreciate the
Appreciate
the
it.
candor and coming on and talking about it.
Oh man, no, I appreciate you doing this. I think it's a really cool thing. I was gonna ask you, so what spurred this on? Like what was it that made you say, hey, I need to ask this question?
Yeah, I think for me, it's mostly about I grew up in a very I would call it sheltered area, in the west of Chicago, where we're all white. We all come from the middle class. Most everybody that I knew was Christian or at least went to a Christian church, even if they weren't, quote unquote Christian. And then as I've gotten older and I've seen more of the world and, you know, more diversity, I just find it fascinating how people can start as a kid, believing one thing and either getting to the point where they can solidify what they've already believed
Mm-hmm.
or they can turn to something else several times. And obviously a couple of different cases in our friends. So that's really what spurred it on. I don't know why the timing was, and I think a lot of it had to do with COVID and just sitting around, just kind of thinking like, is like the world ending? And if so, like, what does that mean? What do I believe? And
Yeah.
it's just a weird time in the world, and I think it's probably spurred by the fact that we were indoors for 6 months with nothing to do.
Probably had something to do with it. So do you think, let me ask you this.
Yeah,
If you were if you were given the evidence that would say that here it is, Christianity is true, would you believe that?
it's a tough question. It depends on the evidence. I think. I think if you were to present me with anything that was based in a empirical standpoint, it's going to be
Mm-hmm.
hard to look at that and say no.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only thing I could think of that would relate to this is like election deniers. If they're presented
Yeah.
with the data that says this person lost and they say no, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And I don't know why it would be any different with a religion standpoint and people providing you with data. But
Yeah.
I think I will say that a lot of like what we talked about today has been based on faith, and it's hard to prove something to believe. You
Mm-hmm.
have to just do it. And I think all these other things that we've talked about help frame that belief for you. I don't know that would help in that same light for me
Sure.
because maybe different things are important for different people. But if I went through that process and came to it, like who's to say that that faith couldn't grow in whatever religion or whatever higher power that may or may not be out there.
See, I think that's a good answer. I think I really enjoyed listening to this weekend. I listened to you and Paige.
Hmm.
I thought that was just an incredibly candid, and it was just good. And I admire the fact that and Paige said it. I mean, that was the name of the podcast. Is she's like, I don't know. And I don't know if you said that, but it kind of had the sense that you were like willing to say that too. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but just kind of like, I respect the fact that you're willing to hear out what there is out there and willing to say, I don't know right now, but it doesn't mean that I wouldn't make up my mind in the future if presented with certain facts. But I think that it takes a lot of honesty and integrity to just acknowledge, I don't know. I think
Yeah,
that's a really good place to be. So I think that's cool. I really appreciate it.
yeah, I appreciate that, man. And I think for right now in my life, I'm comfortable not knowing. I think Paige is a little bit more uncomfortable. She's just starting this journey of like what she believes and whatnot. But I think for me, I'm comfortable in the unknown right now because I'm still trying to figure out like what are those most important things, and
Yep.
has what I was brought up in, does that jive? And it's not like I've been a practicing Christian for a lot of the years more recently. So, we'll see where this journey takes us.
It's kind of like you're doing like speed dating right now. You're like talking to all these
Yeah.
different people, and you're like, okay, so what do you like?
Yeah.
And you're trying to
Mo-
figure out what you think.
Mostly white Christians for right now, but we're gonna try to fix that. Have a
Yeah,
little
there
bit
you
more
go.
diversity on here and other religions, but
Yeah.
I think that kind of, I joke, but I mean that kind of goes back to like why this I feel like this is important for me is because those experiences, like a lot of us had the same type of experiences because of where we grew up, and I just feel like we have to explore and just listen to other people that are out there.
Yeah, speed dating's great. That's great. But if before you make up your mind on anything, you probably do want to give it a little more thought. Go out on a few dates with whatever you decide to do, um, or believe or don't believe. But I would ask you that. How about this? One more question for you. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm like bugging you with questions.
This is great, man. We'll edit this out. I'm
That's
just
fine.
joking. I'm just
It's
joking.
totally fine. You can. Um, have you read the Gospels seriously since you've been an adult and like given them some thought and read through them?
I'm not word for word. And I think a lot of that too, Lou, is not because I don't want to. It's because of how I was raised and where I was raised. So I mentioned last week, my dad was a pastor growing up. So we always had, religion around us, and I was at church every week. Sometimes, especially during like Lent, you're there 3 times a week.
Yeah.
And so you're doing all this work in Bible school or in the journey to your first communion, catechism, going through all that stuff, and so it's drilled into you for so long that it gets to a point where if I have the opportunity to read the Bible, why the hell would I read the Bible? You know what I mean? Like I just got away from having to do all this stuff,
You've had
and so
enough.
yeah, and so as a 34 almost 35-year old, I haven't prioritized it. I've
Yep.
read a lot about what is in it, and I've listened to a lot of debates. I know me and Keenan talked about like Christopher Hitchens and some of the more famous reverends that are
Mhm.
out there. Like that's the type of stuff I've kind of dug my teeth into, but
Yep.
actually reading what's written on the pages, I just haven't. Maybe I should.
Well, I would say just because I say this just because it's had such an impact on me. If you were to pick up a book like the Book of John, the Gospel of John, where it just documents Jesus's life, it's the story about Jesus's life. You could mow through that thing in no time.
Mhm.
Honestly, maybe like an hour or so. I think it would be. I think if you ever seriously consider it, if you really want to dig a little bit deeper, it's best to hear it just from the horse's mouth. You can pick up the Gospel of John, you can see what Jesus had to say. And for me, that kind of thing, like, and that's what I was saying a little bit earlier, was like going to the source yourself. It's a really different experience than something that's gone through the filter of someone else's mind. Or like you
Sure.
talking to me, that's one thing, but your ability to go to it yourself and read it, it really wouldn't take too long. And I think it would. I think you'd find it beneficial. You might not believe it, but I think it would give you a unique perspective.
Yeah, I think the Book of John is the one that I probably am the most familiar with, just because it's probably the easiest one to read, just
Yeah,
from my recollection as a kid. So yeah, maybe when I'm done with the Goosebumps series, we'll dig into the Bible.
there you go. Yeah,
Did you ever read Goosebumps?
yeah. I think. Well, it was a show, right? It was like a
Hell
creepy
yeah, there was a
show.
show. Yeah,
Yeah,
don't
I think
don't go down
it
in the
really
basement.
scared me. Yeah, as a kid, I think I don't know. It scared me.
Yeah, that and Animorphs. Super into
Oh
Animorphs.
yeah, Animorphs.
Also came out with a show that was pretty bad. Um, but hey, maybe they'll renew it. We can only
Never
hope, Lou.
know.
Can
Yep,
only
you never
hope.
know.
All right, pal. This was super awesome. Again, I know that you're a busy dude with a family and a new baby out there. So first, congratulations on all that good stuff. And I just appreciate your time and having this, very candid conversation. I know it's not easy to ask these types of questions to a buddy, but I think it's super important. And you're obviously a dude, like I said before, that's thought a lot about it. So I respect you a lot.
Thanks, Miles. Appreciate it, man. It was great.
All right, pal. Talk to you soon.
Bye.